Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Jeff Goodall, Rolling Stone writer, author of The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.
So this is your seventh book and your number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list I saw. So congratulations on that. I want to start with, are you surprised at the intensity of this summer's heat?
Yeah, yes and no. Obviously, I wrote this book about heat, which I started 4 years ago because I knew that I had an instinct that, you know, heat was going to be increasingly important and that we don't understand very well how heat works, especially to our bodies and the risks and dangers of it. So I really wanted to talk about that. The models that climate scientists have been showing us for decades, the general warming that we've been seeing is right on exactly kind of what they predicted. So there's no surprises in that sense. What's surprising is the extremity of these heat waves that are happening right now, the fact they're happening all around the world. It just shows that these extreme events are getting, more and more extreme, and the risks are growing faster and faster.
One of the dilemmas I think about is Europe, which on the one hand has had obviously record-setting heat waves again, but it seems a lot of restrictions and certainly a cultural bias against air conditioning, which arguably would add to the problem of global warming. What do you think about when you think about some of the dilemmas that different parts of the world face? I mean, is it very similar as you've looked around the globe, or do you see sort of unique challenges per area?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and there, it is very different in lots of different places. Partly because some cultures and countries are culturally more sophisticated about how they deal with heat. I mean, there's a reason there's a such thing as a siesta in Mexico, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
a break during a hot part of the day. And people, my wife is from Mexico City, and, people are used to dealing with heat, and they know that, like, you get up early in the morning, you work in the cool of the morning, and then you take a break in the middle of the day when it's hot, and then you work into the evening. So there's various levels of kind of cultural sophistication about heat. A lot of the places where the risk is most extreme are places where people are not equipped for it and are not educated about it. And the perfect example of that was the heat wave that hit the Pacific Northwest in 2021,
Mm-hmm.
Seattle, British Columbia, where over 1,000 people died. Very few people have air conditioning there. Very few people understand the risks of heat at all, what to do, how to deal with it. And so this sort of these regions that are sort of unprepared for it are the ones that are paradoxically the most at risk.
It's interesting. One of the reasons you wrote this book you mentioned was, I think, walking several blocks in Phoenix during a particularly hot period, and yet you live in Texas. That sounds a little like self-flagellation. What makes you want to be located there?
Love.
Okay.
I fell in love with a woman who lived in Texas, and I had the choice of either not. I mean, she had a job here that couldn't move, and I either, lived with her in Texas or lived without her somewhere else, and I chose to live with her in Texas. And I have to say, at
Fair
the time
enough.
when I went to Phoenix and I had my kind of epiphany that caused me to, embark on this book. I wasn't living in Texas. I was living
Mm.
in upstate New York. I grew up in California. It's not like I had never experienced extreme heat, but something about that day, something about those extreme temperatures, then amplified by all the concrete and all the asphalt around me, something about my naivete about the risks of heat really struck me that day. And I really understood that I didn't really understand how dangerous this all was.
I'm curious the degree to which you're seeing not cause for hope, but it is a very binary conversation about, you know, the doomsday scenarios that we're seeing. I think there was another piece in Science recently about Greenland and essentially the impact of what that we glean from that in terms of water levels going up higher than expected, and then, a certain level of denial that will be okay. You're more down the middle path. Give me some sense as to where you see interesting solutions, and is this likely to continue unabated?
Well, how it continues or not, and the degree to which it continues, and how much hotter it gets, and how more extreme these impacts get, is directly related to how quickly we stop burning fossil fuels. They are the main reason why this is happening. That is the most urgent thing that we can do, is to get off of fossil fuels. And we have a lot of control over that through various policies. Building power plants and creating energy from clean energy is cheaper in all parts of the world, which is a very different scenario than it was even a decade ago. So a lot of the future and what it's going to look like is in our control in many ways. And I really resist this sort of binary, not that you're doing that, but a lot of people do have a binary kind of, are we doomed or are we not? And the frank truth is that we have put it, in motion tremendous big planetary scale changes because of the CO2 that we've loaded into the atmosphere, and that is going to stay there for thousands of years. We need to understand that, grasp that, accept that these changes are coming, but then there's a lot we can do about it. We can reduce fossil fuel emissions. We can think differently about how we build cities, about where we get energy, where our food comes from. I find it to be a very exciting and hopeful moment, and that's why I write about this. I don't write about it because I think we're doomed. I write because I think that we have an opportunity to build a better world at this moment.
You've spoken, I'm sure, to a number of leaders of fossil fuel companies, oil and gas industry in Texas and beyond. What they want, and they have a seat at the table in the climate debate. Do you feel that they're stepping up to do what needs to be done?
Well, first of all, we need to realize that we're generalizing. When you say we're every company, it's all different, right? Just as there's different, there's just different characters, different personalities. Some are doing more and less than others. But look, it's very generally true that the strategy of the fossil fuel industry is to drag this out as long as possible. They're concerned about stranded assets for a lot of the infrastructure they have. They want to be seen as good citizens because they don't want to lose the sort of social license for operating, basically. They want this to happen, this transition to happen slowly in general. Some are better than others, but they've sowed decades of mistrust. ExxonMobil knew about the impacts of burning fossil fuels and CO2 levels decades ago. I think that I think that they are very problematic in this discussion, and I don't know that they should be excluded per se, but I do think that we need to be skeptical when they tell us they're going to do something, and when they talk about their role in this, because they have not been transparent in that in the past.
I want to get back to the heart and soul of your book in terms of it really is many ways from a consumer perspective, warnings about how we are not prepared, how this is an invisible killer, I think is the term you use with heat. So let's start with the role of government in this scenario. There's a lot of talk of climate justice. When there's a heat wave, they'll create cooling centers. What more can be done other than the education that this type of book provides to protect people from heat?
Well, the first thing that needs to be done, and the governments can do and should do, is treat these extreme heat events and the climate crisis in general like the emergency that it is. This is not, this is a moment when lives are at stake. And, their governments are pretty good at mobilizing people and messaging during, say, hurricanes, right? When a hurricane's coming, there's really good all hands on deck, there's a ranking system so you know how bad the hurricane's going to be. There's lots of messaging about evacuation routes. There's shelters. There's a full-scale mobilization. There's nothing like that during extreme heat events at all. I see that here, in Texas where I live, where we just lived through 2 weeks of this extreme heat.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's still seen as something that, people should just deal with themselves and handle themselves. We need better messaging about this. We need, there are still cities that will shut off electric power for people who don't pay bills when they're trying to crank up, their air conditioning. So people are dying in apartments and in houses because they can't afford to turn on their air conditioner, or they don't have power because they're behind on their bills by a month or something. We have a governor here in Texas who, during the height of this heat wave 2 weeks ago, signed legislation prohibiting local communities and cities from instituting shade and water breaks for outdoor construction workers. I mean, that is just, barbaric. And, that is emblematic of like the problem in the way that, governments are functioning in this moment of crisis.
You raise a good point. I think only 3 states, if I'm correct, have actual laws regarding in extreme heat how much a worker can be exposed. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's 3. I'm not
3, and then there's
one,
3 others that I think sort of have particular conditions, but still, the majority of U.S. states, there's nothing stopping an employer from saying, well, I don't care if it's 120 degrees, 110 degrees, you've got to get the job done.
Exactly. And, there's been OSHA has, the federal administration has been working on a heat standard for years. They haven't done it yet. It's this exact kind of thing that, caused the death of a farm worker that I write about in my book in Oregon during the 2021 heat wave, because he was faced, like a lot of outdoor workers are faced with the decision of, if I take a water break or a shade break, I'm afraid I'm going to get fired. I can't afford to get fired, so I'm going to keep working. And he ended up dead.
Mm-hmm. The evolution of your own thinking, you've been covering these issues for 20 years. The point you're at now, even the reaction to this book, give me some sense of sort of where your focus is as you're looking at, what's around the corner. Are there particular innovations that interest you? Are there particular conversations, even models that you found? You mentioned the siesta, like there's a certain, cultures that have long dealt with heat know how to deal with it. But what else is on your radar that you would put on ours as ways to deal with this?
Well, what I'm sort of most inspired by, and, one of the things that gives me, as I said, I'm kind of very hopeful, even though I think that we're going to go through a time of enormous suffering and change. But I think also I'm very hopeful about what's going on is how the conversation in general is changing. The reception of my book has been great, and I think that's emblematic of people are at the point now where they want to learn more and they want to think more about this. 20 years ago, when I first started writing about climate change and energy issues, I joke sometimes that it was like I was writing about the sex life of porcupines. It was something that like nobody cared about and just thought was sort of cute and weird. And now it's the center of every conversation that I have and the people that I meet. Everybody wants to know, where should I live? How should I invest? What do I do in the heat? What do I tell my kids? Should I have kids? Should I not? It's become so much a part of everybody's conversation. And that is what's really great, because that, I think, is going to inspire a lot of creativity, a lot of people thinking differently. I meet architects all the time who are thinking about building buildings in a completely different way, so they don't need to use air conditioning, using natural circulations like architects used to know how to do 500 years ago. People built amazing structures in the Middle East without air conditioning. Even here in Texas, you can see, it wasn't like Texas was a ghost town prior to the arrival of air conditioning. There are these dog trot houses that have, natural ventilation and things like that. So there's a lot of rethinking about that. I think, I see what's happening in cities like Paris, where they're really changing the character of the inner city, building a lot more green space, pushing cars out, allowing much more access for bicycles, a much more kind of connected to nature kind of city in this incredibly beautiful, uh, capital of civilization. I see them restoring, this 1,500-year-old aqueduct in Athens to bring water into the center of Athens so there can be more parks and greenery. I just think there's so many inspired solutions happening out there on every level and in every place that all you have to do is open your eyes and look for it and talk to people and you will see it. And that is what gives me a lot of hope.
It's interesting that they're very private sector solutions, a lot of what you've discussed. And I remember when I was in college, and my first job at UNEP was when the Montreal Protocol came out, and that was about chlorofluorocarbons, late 80s. And that, I'm hard pressed to think of many other international agreements that have actually stuck. And as the politics becomes more polarized, what are you seeing on the regulatory front in terms of, this sort of government-driven solutions which really do help us achieve these at scale?
Yeah, well, I think President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act was and is incredibly effective. It has driven a lot of innovation, a lot of money for adaptation in marginal communities, which has been very much needed. So I think that's a very hopeful sort of sign. The international climate agreements are very problematic. I've been following them for a long time. There's a lot of talk, not enough action. Things like the Green Climate Fund, which is set up to help distribute money from the wealthy nations of the West, which after all are the people that caused the problem. We meaning the wealthy nations of the West, burned all the fossil fuels that put the CO2 in the atmosphere that is now causing the problems in the global South. And, what do we owe them? How much money do we owe them to help them adapt to the problems we caused? That's very problematic and very fraught. Government has an extraordinarily important role to play in this, and you're seeing it play out in different ways in different places. Some cities are better than others, some states are better than others. I think broadly we're moving in the right direction. I think that, the problem with everything about this story is that it's not happening fast enough given the changes that are happening in our climate. We're in a race against physics.
Yeah, that's very fair. Let's end with the individual and what you want them to take away from this book. Obviously, there's a certain be careful, be wary, be respectful of the impact that heat can have on you and your body and such. Anything else that you think is an important takeaway?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is, the urgency of the moment, that we are in this transformational moment. We are not going back to the climate that we all grew up in. We're moving into a completely different climate era. We don't know what the rules are. We don't know how hot it could really get. We're having these extreme heat waves now. 120 degrees in Phoenix, can it get to be 130, 135? Maybe it can. And we don't really know what this new world looks like. So we have to be prepared. And being prepared means most of all being educated about what these risks are and at least being able to think about them a little bit, prepare for them, talk to others about them, share knowledge, because the big point of my book is that we're all in this together.
Great. Well, I think it's definitely an excellent place to start. The heat will kill you first. Jeff Goodell, thanks for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.